Assalamualaikum. Welcome to Candid Talks, organized by MCOB, which stands for Allied Muslim Chamber of Business. MCOB is a membership-based social enterprise with a mission to create a thriving Muslim business community. It's the power of collective wisdom, continued learning, and thought leadership brought together for Muslims by Muslims. Our core belief is that business leaders thrive when they have access to a supportive community of peers who challenge and inspire each other. Our guest today is Meira Neggaz. Meira is the Executive Director at Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is a nonprofit organization providing objective research and education about American Muslims to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. Today, we'll be exploring some recent research work done by ISPU and what it tells about our community. Welcome, Meira.
Welcome. Assalamu alaikum. It's nice to be here with you all.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Please share with us a little bit more about ISPU.
So the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, much better known as ISPU, is a 21-year-old research and education organization. It was founded by a group of young Muslim professionals and academics, mostly out of the state of Michigan, but also we had a founder in Ohio and California. And it was shortly after the attacks of 9/11 when there was a lot of discussion about Muslims, but so little of it was based on fact. There was just clearly a large information gap about Muslim communities in the United States and about their experiences, their challenges. And our founders really wanted to try to fill this information gap with actual facts instead of all these talking heads who are just sort of often making things up. And so 21 years later, that's still what we do. We do a large amount of research on the challenges, opportunities, trends, experiences, demographics of Muslim communities in the United States. And we do that really so that people can make better decisions and have much more informed conversations. We hope that by doing all of this, we will further, sort of create an America where Muslims are both thriving, thriving communities and equal, just like every other American. So that's really the sort of aim of what we do. And we do that by doing this rigorous research and putting it into the right hands of people who can actually utilize it.
All right, thank you. So how does ISPU engage with the Muslim community to ensure their voices are heard and their needs are addressed?
Yeah. So we were really born out of the grassroots Muslim community, right? It was a very much a grassroots initiative from the get-go. And I think that's what makes us sort of unique, honestly, as a research organization. I haven't come across many other research organizations that are really rooted in a community. So we are quite unique in that regard. And we engage Muslim communities or work within Muslim communities in a lot of different ways. I guess, number one, we have a large network of relationships across the country. We are a nationwide organization. We have a large network of relationships across the country with Muslim leaders, Muslim organizations, Muslim community leaders, so that we can really always have our pulse on the concerns that people are feeling. What are people worried about? What are the challenges that people are facing? We want to make sure that we are responsive to those needs. So when we do our research, we're not just making things up. We're actually looking at real challenges and things that people want to solve for. So that's one thing, is just that large network of relationships. We're in a lot of coalitions and things like that. So we constantly have our ear to the ground of what Muslim communities are experiencing and facing. But then the second piece of that is the research itself. We want to be responsive to community needs. And then through the research, we are able to amplify the voices and experiences of Muslims in, a large amount of spaces. So through that research, we do focus groups, we do interviews, we do surveys that really capture the pulse and the opinions of Muslim Americans. And then we take what we learn, we amplify those voices in the halls of Congress, in newsrooms, among educators, among advocates, among a whole sort of host of people. So we really are very grassroots oriented and rooted. But we're able to take what we learn and amplify those voices in a lot of different spaces.
Okay, all right. No, that's good to know. Can you share some community-driven initiatives that have been taking that have come out from ISPU's research projects?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I always feel like I'm spoiled for choice when people ask me these kinds of questions, which is a great problem to have, right? To have too many to think about. But maybe if I could just give you a few examples, because I think community-driven initiatives happen in a number of different ways. So I'll give you a few small examples to illustrate what that looks like. So one way in which we catalyze change is through starting new initiatives. So, we'll find a data point, we'll research something, and something will spark this initiative where people are like, oh, that's really a problem. We actually really need to do something about that, where they may not have been thinking about it before. So one example of that is our bullying data. Back in, I think it was 2016 or 2017, when we first started doing our American Muslim poll, which I can talk about a little bit later, but essentially it's a survey of Muslims and other Americans of other or no faith to really look at a lot of different questions, and how Muslims are experiencing certain things, as compared to their fellow Americans. So early on, we looked at religious-based bullying. How were Muslim children and Muslim families experiencing or not bullying? And what we found was quite alarming. What we found was that nearly half, and now it is, really close to half of American Muslim families who have school-aged children have at least one child who is being bullied because of their religion. And that number has stayed pretty steady since we started tracking in 2016. So when that number first came out, there was just suddenly a real effort to address it, because now there was sort of this evidence that this was a major, major problem. So one of those initiatives that came out of that was the American Muslim health professionals. They saw that and they said, we got to do something about this. So they created a conference. Actually, it was the Interfaith Anti-Bullying Conference. I can't remember if that was what it was called. It was something like that, where they pulled together people across faiths, who may be more inclined to experience religious-based bullying. And we had a 2-day conference. And ISP was the research partner on that. So we actually produced a paper, which you can find on our website, about how to address religious-based bullying, which is now used by educators, far and wide. So that's one example of a community initiative that grew out of a data point. Another way in which ISPU sort of sparks action is by helping Muslim organizations, Muslim leaders, and other non-Muslims who are looking to support Muslim communities to build better institutions, right? So to strengthen the ability to serve Muslim communities in the most effective way. So one example of that is our Reimagining Muslim Spaces project. This project looked at sort of mosque governance and mosque, the ability of mosques to meet the needs of very diverse constituents who attend mosques. So we looked more specifically at women and young people and converts and African American Muslims, and looked at the ways in which mosques were or were not being inclusive in their spaces. And what ended up happening as a result of that project, the project also included a bunch of case studies on how to create programs that served the needs of their constituents. So workforce development programs, health programs, things like that. So a number of mosques across the country started adopting the findings from this study. Some mosques that we talked to, they actually started programs based on the case studies that we provided. Other ones looked at their inclusivity measures, did surveys across their constituents, realized that some people were feeling left out, and then used our resources to try to address that. So that's a second example of sort of how the research sparks real change and strengthening of Muslim communities and Muslim institutions.
Okay. How do you measure your success?
Yeah, that's always a challenging thing, right? Especially when it comes to research. We, as a research institution, we
Mhm.
obviously care a lot about measurements. That's important to us in every way, and one of those ways is in measuring our impact. Many years ago, we developed an impact framework. So we have a whole set of metrics that help us know whether we are doing good and sort of doing what we say we're doing. Um, the way we think about our programs are that we discover, we educate, and we equip. So most of our programs follow that sort of spectrum. And what that means is that we discover through doing original research. We then take that research to educate the public. And that can be through public forums, through community discussions, through talks in different places. It could be through partnering with the media. You know, we share our research with a lot of journalists. And so it gets out far and wide. We have podcasts, we have online courses. So we discover and we educate. And then we also use that research to equip leaders. Those leaders really can be anybody who has some kind of sphere of influence. It could be a teacher in a classroom, it could be an advocate, it could be an elected official, it could be a business leader, you know, anyone who has like this ability to implement the research. And we do that through trainings, workshops. We do toolkits where we bring things together for particular types of workers. So discover, educate, and equip. Our impact framework follows that, right? So we think about what is success in education? What is success in equipping? And we have a whole set of metrics that talks about that. It's not just the number of people that we reach, which runs in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, but also in the quality of how that is reached. So we collect a lot of impact stories. People who come to us and say, I run a domestic violence program in California, and your research was instrumental in helping us figure out how to put our limited resources to actually be able to do that in the most effective way possible, right? So we collect these stories that help us understand what the impact might be.
And I'm assuming that these influential people, they are not just from the Muslim community; they are also wide range. Anybody who is in that position.
Very broad. Yes, we have a very broad set of constituents who utilize our research. Honestly, anyone who is interested in learning more about Muslim communities, in taking what they learn and whether it's implementing it in their personal lives or their professional lives, our research is really for everybody.
All right. In the past, I believe you started the um, American Muslim Pod about 6, 7 years ago.
Mhm.
And since from the time that you started it and from now, what are the trends that you are seeing through your research?
Yeah. So the American Muslim Survey, just to dive into what that is a little bit more, what we wanted to do was really provide an opportunity for Muslim voices and experiences to be heard in all sectors. So since 2016, we have been surveying Muslims alongside a broad a broad sampling of Americans of other and of no faith. And what we do is we look at that and we sort of look at where the trends are, where the challenges are. And that survey has told us millions of things. The bullying data was one piece that came out of that. And we've been tracking not just bullying, but discrimination writ large for many years. So since 2016 through the last poll, which was in 2022. And this is some of the only data that we have that illustrates what Islamophobia and discrimination against Muslims actually has looked like. So one example of how that matters is earlier this year, we were involved in a number of initiatives. One was working with policymakers around combating Islamophobia. Also, the United Nations was looking at how counterterrorism measures over the past 20 years have really been harmful to Muslim communities. And there were a number of other initiatives taking place in businesses. A number of business leaders were coming to us asking for DEI type initiatives. And I could go on and on. But essentially, a lot of people wanted to understand what Islamophobia and anti-Muslim discrimination looked like. Thankfully, we have a large body of research that talks about that from our American Muslim Survey. And what we know, for example, to your question about trends, is that Muslim communities experience anti-Muslim discrimination in a sort of different way than other communities who may also be experiencing religious-based discrimination. What makes Muslims really unique is the level of institutionalized discrimination that is leveled at Muslim communities. And that is everything from people interacting with law enforcement, people applying for jobs, within the banking industry, Muslims in banking, whether it's individual accounts, business accounts, or nonprofit accounts, when traveling and going through airports. I mean, these are things that I think anecdotally many within the community know, right? They've experienced these things, but to see them in a really rigorously conducted poll and to understand that Muslims really are singled out, they really do experience these things in a much more sort of systematized way, has been really eye-opening for people. And it's really helped spark a lot of action around combating Islamophobia. But we've also looked at other trends. We've looked a lot at political engagement, civic and political engagement. And we know a lot about what that looks like within Muslim communities. So for example, when we first started measuring, what we identified was the biggest gap. This was around the 2016 elections. And what was clear was that there was a real gap between Muslims who said they'd intended to vote, which was around 85% of Muslims at that time said that they had intended to vote. But only 60% of Muslims at that time were actually registered to vote. So there was this sort of 25% that we coined the Insha'Allah voters, right? This 25% of Muslims who said, yeah, we're going to vote, but they were not taking steps to actually make that a reality. And this became a real understanding amongst the organizations that work in political engagement, right? They said, okay, we need to direct resources towards closing that Inshallah voter gap and get people who intend to vote registered. Well, a few years later, what we saw, and I don't know all the reasons for this. It could be the great work of our partner organizations. It could be just that the elections became more, imperative. I don't know. But a few years later, that Inshallah gap had largely closed. And actually now there's not such a huge gap between those who say they want to vote and those who are registered to vote. That gap has essentially been closed, at least in the last election. So these are the kinds of things that we're able to gather from this poll.
Okay. When we talk about Muslim population, and of course, it's not like just one group. It's a very diversified. What do we know about Muslims in America?
Yeah, so I think, the number one question we always get asked, and spoiler alert, I can't answer this with any certainty, but the number one question we always get asked first is how many Muslims are in the United States? And, unfortunately, that question is a really difficult one to answer because, religion is not included on the American census. And so without including religion on the census, we're never going to have a really solid number. When people ask us that question, we always point them to the Pew Research Center. I think they have the most reliable or rigorously thought through numbers that show about 3.5 million Muslims, or just around 1% of the population. But what do we know about that, right? Like, who are those 3.5 million people? Well, we know from our research that it is Muslims are the most diverse faith group in America, hands down. It's the only faith group that we studied that have no majority race or ethnicity. And so, I mean, the numbers, shift here and there, but it's roughly a third are African American. Roughly 1/5 to 1/4 are Arab. No, Asian. Sorry. Arabs make up about a fifth. Um, White Muslims also make up about a fifth, and white Muslims, people are always really curious about who those people are. Some of them, yes, they're probably converts to Islam, but white Muslims could also be Bosnian. They could also be Chechen. Like, there are a number of other Muslim ethnicities that may define themselves as white. I think what's really interesting is 8% of Muslims are Latino. That's nearly 10% of the Muslim population in the United States are Latino, and 2% are Native American. So Muslims really are incredibly, incredibly diverse. And each of those groups experiences life differently, right? If you're Black and Muslim, you may experience life differently than someone who maybe is Arab and Muslim, or Latino and Muslim. And so when in our surveys, and actually in research that we've been doing over the past couple of years, we're really diving in deep into what that looks like. What does it look like to be Latino and Muslim? What does it look like to be Black and Muslim? And how do interfaith dynamics play out in Native American communities, or African American communities, or Latino communities, or South Asian communities? We're looking at all four of those subpopulations and those dynamics. So yeah, it's a really, really diverse community.
Okay, all right. And related to having that diversity, and of course, you have to focus on each group separately because they may have their intricacies that you have to address those. So, what are the main challenges that you encounter in your effort to promote social equality?
Yeah, there are a lot. Thankfully, I think, the great thing about research, so on the positive note, and then I'll answer your question, but on a positive note, I think research is a great leveler. It's when you come into a conversation with opinions,
Mhm,
it's really easy for other people to discount them, right? They'll find a million ways to poke holes in those opinions.
mhm,
When you come in with facts that are really rigorously collected, I mean, we're a very rigorous research organization. It sort of levels the playing field a little bit and allows for conversations that maybe people might not have been open to if you had come at it from a different angle. So I think that's one real strength of research, and um, how that can ground so many of the conversations that are happening today. There are a lot of challenges, though, as you rightly asked about. So a couple of them that I can think of. Number one, let's go back to that diversity piece. I think diversity of the Muslim community, or Muslim communities, is an incredible strength. Quite frankly, it's probably a forebearer of what America is going to look like in the next 30 years, where there actually is expected not to be any kind of majority race or ethnicity. So Muslim communities are actually a little further ahead in that regard, and I think that's a great strength. But it can also be a challenge because there is no one Muslim community. There's no one voice. There's no one set of policy priorities or challenges, right? There are a myriad of all of those things. And so sometimes, that can be a little bit of a challenge when your constituency is incredibly diverse and not everybody agrees on everything. So you can't speak with just one voice. I think another challenge is that Islamophobia really is systemic. Back to what I said a little bit earlier, it's sometimes hard to even get the opportunity to talk about challenges facing Muslims. So, for example, a lot of DEI initiatives within companies or elsewhere just don't take religion into account as one of the measures of inclusivity, right? They focus a lot on race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation and all of these things that need to be talked about, but religion doesn't often get included in that. And so people are having to do a lot of internal advocacy just to get to the point where an organization like ISPU is invited in to talk about some of these challenges. Um, and so that can be difficult as well. Um, Obviously, with research, as I mentioned before, we discover, we educate, and we equip. And what we hope is that through this research and our relationships with this wide swathe of people who can utilize it, we're sort of passing the baton to them. But we can't guarantee, number one, that people will use what we share with them, nor that they'll use it in the right ways, right? So that's always a little bit of a challenge in the work that specifically ISPU does, is just, we hope that people will have smarter conversations. We hope they'll make better decisions. But all we can do is really do the best research we can and get it out as widely as possible in the ways that people can utilize it and hope that they actually do. And then the last thing I would say for challenges is just resources. Our field, just writ large, I mean, the constellation or the orbit of organizations that are serving Muslim communities, and certainly ISPU, we're just vastly under-resourced. Our budgets are too small to do what we need to do. And as compared to other communities, our institutions are still just struggling often to have the resources that they need. And ISPU is no exception. We are absolutely in that same boat. So I would say those are the main challenges we face.
Okay, all right. And we talked about some of the stuff related to, like, you did the study of Muslims for American progress, and
Mhm.
how they have contributed in achieving the American dream in a way. So, if you can shed some light on from that aspect.
Yeah. So the Muslims for American Progress Project is one of my favorites. I really love this project. What we did was we looked at Muslim contributions to the United States, sort of to the health, happiness, and well-being of fellow Americans. And we did two case studies to look at that. We looked at the state of Michigan and we looked at New York City. Those were the two places where we looked. We had hoped to do a similar study in the South and also on the West Coast so that we could have examples from all over the country. But again, limited resources. So we did New York City and Michigan. Those were the two we were able to do. And we looked across a lot of different issue areas to look at Muslim contributions, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So we got a bunch of numbers to tell that story, as well as people, like actual people who were doing really interesting things. And just because those listening in are probably most likely business leaders, I'll focus on the economics aspect. But we looked at engineering, we looked at arts, we looked at politics, we looked at education, we looked at social services, we looked across a lot of different issue areas. But in terms of economics, I think the story of Muslim business owners was really striking. Muslims are entrepreneurs and job creators, and I don't think I need to tell any of you on this call. You are all you are all those people who are doing that. But in New York City, for example, Muslims owned an estimated more than 95,000 small businesses, so just under 100,000 small businesses in New York City. This was back in 2016. And for these businesses, Muslim New Yorkers created nearly 200,000 jobs. So that's a lot of businesses owned by Muslims and a lot of jobs created by Muslims. And we estimated that there were more than 250,000 workers employed by Muslim-owned small businesses in New York City that year alone in 2016. And in Michigan, the story is very similar. So I think those are the kinds of stories that don't often get told that often. And these studies have been really vital. So, for example, when New Yorkers have been advocating with City Hall or other elected officials to serve their constituents in a better way, this data, this sort of information is taken to City Hall or to those elected officials to say, look, you can't ignore this this massive population that are great contributors to not only the economics, but our education system and all these other ways in which people are contributing. So another kind of interesting way that this research has been shared, a couple of years back, we did a sort of training or a workshop with Hollywood scriptwriters. And they were really interested in creating stories of Muslims doing, just normal things. Not, as you all probably sort of observe, many Muslims characters in TV shows and stuff are either victims of Islamophobia or they're somehow, nefarious and doing something bad. And so these Hollywood scriptwriters really wanted to understand, how do we write better stories about real people? And so we shared this, Muslims for American Progress. We said we've highlighted nearly 80 people across the arts, sports, all these things. Draw some inspiration from that. These are amazing people. So if you're interested in looking at that study, it's just www.muslimsforamericanprogress.org, and it's really interesting.
All right. No, I would definitely check it out, and our audience would do too. You also did some research related to you talked about the banking industry and also halal industry, halal food industry. Anything that you want to share from those research areas?
Yeah, I think so. We did look at banking while Muslim, and we looked at that because anecdotally, we have heard and we had been hearing that a number of people had been having their bank accounts closed or credit cards, denied or payments stopped without any kind of explanation or warning. And this was happening to individuals, but it was also happening to nonprofits and to businesses. And so we partnered with LaunchGood, who I'm sure you're all, or many of you are familiar with. They're a platform that collects donations for really worthy causes around the world, and with Islamic Relief USA. So we partnered with the two of them to conduct this research. And what we found indeed was that Muslims were far more likely than any other faith group and more likely than the general public to experience these kinds of challenges. Don't quote me on this. The research is available on our website, but I believe for Muslim nonprofits and for businesses, they were sort of 3 or 4 times more likely to have these challenges with their business or nonprofit accounts than other nonprofits or other businesses who were not, Muslim owned or Muslim led or Muslim focused. And this is obviously a huge problem. I'm sure, maybe some of your listeners have experienced this, and it's really deeply problematic. It not only harms the individuals who are having to take time to deal with this, um, but it also harms, community development and social service provision and just being able to meet the needs of Muslim communities, and serve, clients that businesses are serving. So this is really a big problem. And with these findings, which were honestly the first ones, this is the first study where this challenge has ever been quantified in this way. At least it's the first that we have heard about or know about. Because this was so glaringly problematic, we've been able to take these findings to, you know, uh, senior policymakers, like really senior level policymakers. We did a briefing, I think it was for the National Economic Council. We've been working with advocates who've been trying to address this issue so that they have this data when they're doing advocacy and meeting with policymakers and others who can affect change. We shared this data with the UN when they were doing their report on the sort of impact of counterterrorism measures on Muslim communities. And so this data has been really, really vital. On the halal front, so we did earlier this year partner with Ifanka, and we looked at halal preferences. So, what percentage of Muslims prefer to purchase halal goods, and food and services, and what does that mean in terms of food insufficiency? So we looked at both food security and sort of nutrition, thinking about nutrition, and also halal preferences. And what we found is that Muslims, among the faith groups that we were able to study, Muslims really in large numbers, it's the vast majority of Muslims either only purchase halal or would prefer to purchase halal. So I think just in terms of business owners who, serve a wide range of people, Costco has a lot of halal meat, which is great, right? Like they serve all kinds of people, but they understand that Muslims largely prefer halal, and so they stock that. And I think our data really proves that makes a lot of sense.
Do you know on top of your head, like how big is that market?
Yeah, I'm gonna try and pull it up while we're talking. I'm sorry, I should have done that before. Um, I don't know what the percentage is. Again, we don't know the number of Muslims in the United States, right? So I can't tell you specifically, like that's, 2 million people. Um, but what I can tell you from our data is that the vast majority of Muslims either prefer or require keeping a halal diet. And that number is, so 37% of Muslims say that they only purchase halal products. Yeah. So for all products that require halal certification, I only purchase halal certified products. That's 37% of the Muslims that we surveyed.
Mhm.
46%, an additional 46% of Muslims say that they mostly prefer halal certified food, but that they occasionally purchase some foods without certification if they're not blatantly haram.
Okay.
So, that's 84% of Muslims either prefer or require.
Mhm. All right. No, that's good to know. And when you are working with the other stakeholders, I'm assuming like most of the Muslims, when you are working with them, the organizations, Muslim organizations, you are working. Um, when you are working with the non-Muslim organizations,
Mhm.
how do they receive you and the cooperation that you get with them?
Yeah, we work with a large amount of organizations and leaders and people who are not Muslim themselves. I think there's a pretty wide recognition that we are all living in this country, we are all Americans. And, one thing we know from our research is that the vast majority of Americans want to live in a country where no one is targeted because of their religion. I mean, that's just, the
Yeah.
vast majority of Americans will say that. And so, we are received very, very well, and we partner with a large number of people outside of the Muslim community as well as within the Muslim community. So, some ways that we do that, for example, we do teacher training. So we work with school districts and schools to educate teachers and administrators on carving out more inclusive spaces in their schools or in their classrooms, and those have done really well. We've worked with the Department of Education they had a 2-day conference this year, and we presented there. So that's one example. We do the same with journalists. We have a lot of journalists in our network who are really interested in issues impacting Muslim communities, and so not only do we share our research, but we have a toolkit for journalists who want to cover Muslims more accurately and creatively, and in more nuanced ways. And we also do journalist trainings. We've done a number of journalist trainings or newsroom trainings. We work with a lot of faith leaders. We partner with organizations like Shoulder to Shoulder, who work
Mhm.
with a broad swathe of faith leaders, and we do regular faith leader trainings across Christian, Jewish, Muslim, faith traditions. On the policy front, we've met pretty regularly with policymakers at all levels: state,
Mhm.
local, federal. So yeah, I think our research is really far and wide, and it's honestly fundamental to having any of these conversations. It grounds those conversations in fact and allows those conversations to be productive.
All right. No, that's good. Knowing what we know now about the Muslim community, and ISPU has been there for 21 years. Looking at the numbers, where what can we predict now that where the community as a whole would be in about 5 years?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I wish I had a crystal I wish I had a crystal ball. Um,
Like
you
any
know,
particular areas that come to your mind that okay, this is where we would be as a community.
yeah, obviously there's so many variables. So, I'm just speaking off the top of my head. This is not, we don't know. We don't have a crystal ball, but certainly what we've seen is that the trends to be more politically engaged have been very strong, right? So I would imagine that would continue in that vein. I mean, I think in recent elections, we've seen a lot more Muslim candidates. We've seen more Muslim voters. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next election, given all that's going on in the world and sort of how people feel about it.
Mhm.
Um, it'll just be interesting to see how that affects, political engagement in the future. I think another area of connection is through our American Muslim surveys, we've not just been asking about sort of quote Muslim issues, we've also been gauging Muslim opinions about American hot button topics, right? So about climate change, about abortion access, about things like that, that sort of Americans are talking about just writ large.
Mhm.
And so I think there's a great opportunity for Muslims to get more involved in issues that are not typically thought of as Muslim issues, right? But every American thinks about these things and hears about these things and probably has opinions about these things. And so our research has shown that there's a lot of opportunity for Muslims to get involved in topics across the board. Um, what else? I think and I hope that Muslim institutions and leaders will continue to just go from strength to strength, right? The nonprofit space in the Muslim communities there are some that are well established and have been around for a long time, but there are a lot of Muslim focused organizations that cropped up after 9/11 or in the past 20 years. And I think, I hope that resources become more available, that these institutions, including ISPU, are able to continue to grow and strengthen and become real pillars, real fixtures on every scene, that when businesses are looking to do DEI initiatives, they know who to contact. They come to us or they come to another organization that's doing really good work. I hope that all of us become just more and more established. And I see that happening, and I think that will happen. I don't know. There's probably a lot more, but those are the things that come to mind.
Okay, all right. Has ISPU just come to mind as I was working on something else? Um, has ISPU done any research on intergenerational? That what like where as I understand, most of the immigrant population, especially the Muslim immigrant population, has started coming into 60s and 70s when immigration was open, and then we have like a second and third generation of them. And so, are there any big differences that we see in those generations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would answer that in two ways. Number one, excuse me, all of our research, especially in the American Muslim Survey, we look across age groups. So
Okay.
we do, when we're asking any question, we're able to look across race and ethnicity, across gender, across age groups. So a lot of our American Muslim Survey research will have age breakdowns, or will examine, are there differences in attitudes among the older Muslims versus the middle-aged Muslims versus the younger Muslims? And there are a number of differences in opinion and attitudes when you look across ages. I would encourage everyone to look at the survey results, which you can find all online, which are www.ispu.org/poll, POLL, because there's so much rich information there to your question. I would also say that so right now, Muslims are a fairly young population, right? I think I'm trying to remember, I think it was in 2016 where we looked at the age breakdown, and we need to look at this more recently, but it was something like 5%. It was a fairly small percentage of Muslims were over the age of 65, I think it was, that we
Mhm.
had the age cutoff. Anyway, what we saw was that there was a large number of younger Muslims, like under the age of 26. I think a quarter of Muslims are between the ages of 18 and 26. And then there's this smaller percentage of Muslims who are aging, who are seniors. But that will change in the coming years, right? A larger percentage of Muslims will be older. And so there's two dynamics at play. One is that there's a fairly sizable percentage of middle-aged Muslims who have senior parents, right? And maybe struggling with health issues or care issues. And in the coming years, there's going to be a larger number excuse me, of aging Muslims. And so this is another way I would answer your question is we need to do research that looks at that. You know, what will this look like? How can families navigate that when it comes time? How do you carve out culturally and religiously appropriate services? Things like Meals on Wheels, just as an example, the halal research that we did is really important for organizations like Meals on Wheels, which provide, nutritional food for
Mhm.
aging people and others. So how do you make sure that those needs are being met? We are, in fact, trying to do this research. We have engaged a scholar right now, and we've done some preliminary needs assessments in the past to look at this too. So if that's a topic of interest, we have some resources on our website, and we really hope to look at that more deeply.
Okay, all right. No, that's all good. So, um, uh, as we are coming up almost at the hour, The last question that I would ask you is, what advice do you give to individuals, organizations, or allies who want to support ISPU's mission and contribute to the well-being of Muslim communities in America?
Um, there's a lot of things that you can do. I think number one is use our research, right? You can tell from I think this conversation that we have research on a lot of different topics. Pretty much anything you might want to know, we might have something for you. So all of our resources are freely available. Just use our research, make good decisions, make decisions and have conversations based on fact, whether in your personal life or in your professional life. I always say that I have a whole bunch of facts in my back pocket that I'm able to like pull out, when people ask me questions. They're just sort of there in my head. If you work in a business where you're doing DEI type initiatives, and you have, you'd like to do something that looks at Muslim experiences within the workplace, we do that as well. So feel free to get in touch. Any questions you have, you can write to us at info@ispu.org. So that's number one. Utilize our research, utilize our services. Number two, share our research. If there are other people in your network who could really benefit from knowing that this exists and that this is there, please just share it. The more people that use a foundation of facts, the better off we will all be. So share it widely. And lastly, I mentioned that we, like everybody else, are chronically under-resourced. If you'd like to donate to support this work, we are running our end of year campaign right now. You can donate at ispu.org. One of the best ways to donate, although every donation of any dollar amount is really, really helpful. Becoming a monthly sustainer is a great way to help us, whether I think I give ISPU like $10 a month. It's just, it's very regular income. So it's awesome. We are also slowly trying to build up an endowment. So if you have big dreams for ISPU and you'd like to learn more about that, you can also contact us. But there are a lot of ways that you can make sure that, this foundation of fact not only is utilized, but will be here for decades.
All right. No, thank you. How big is the budget for ISPU?
We are roughly around 1.5 to 1.8 million. It fluctuates a little given whatever research that we're doing, but as you can tell, to build this vast body of research, it's not a lot.
Yes, yes, definitely. And how many people do we have
We have
within?
12 staff members. 12
Okay.
staff members, but a lot of our research, we contract out experts in that particular topic. So like we have a core staff of 12, but
Mhm.
for every research project, we contract a primary investigator, research analyst, sometimes data analysts, advisors, so that we're getting like the top-notch people doing this research. So we're a small but mighty team that produces a lot of really important work.
No, thank you for doing all the great work that you have been doing for the past 21 years, and inshallah, looking forward to seeing the organization grow further. And we definitely share the link with specifically the American Muslim poll with our newsletter that would go out next month, and along with the posts related to this talk. So we would share with our community so they are more informed, they are able to make better decisions in their lives, whether it's personal or professional. And from there, I see there, as the community is growing, there are a lot more opportunities focus especially on the community where they need certain elements to provide for them. Like banking is one area, halal market is another one, and even the ethnic clothing and all that stuff. It's There is a huge opportunity, and that's why we are seeing like every big chain, they are every or financial institution that they are there to support the Muslim community. So thank you again, Meira. Very nice having you here, and thank you for sharing all the knowledge and expertise that ISPU brings to the table. And looking forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
All right. Thank you.